now. And once again, we will welcome everyone who has joined us for today's session. My name is Mike, and I work with ClearAdmit. ClearAdmit is a company that is a lot of things, but we like to call ourselves an MBA applicant community, especially for folks that are looking for full-time MBA programs in the top 30 MBAs that are offered in the world. Come to our site, check it out. If you have not already, we have a lot of great tips and tricks and advice on getting into those programs, everything from essay topic analyses to interview archive to our world famous, I guess at this point, Plywire feed, where this time of the year, we're seeing a lot of really great news of interview invites coming out from folks on our site who have gotten invited to interview at their school of choice. I know we had a lot of Tepper posts over the last few weeks for that same exact thing. So Jer and his team have been very busy getting those out. Enough about ClearAdmit. Today's session is all about test waivers, the impact that testing has on MBA admissions, why waivers exist in MBA admissions, and what advantages and disadvantages applicants would have if they were to go through the waiver process. And with that topic, we have a school, Carnegie Mellon Tepper, who has an MBA waiver as part of their full-time MBA program, as well as with some of their other MBA offerings. And the executive director, and I can say out loud, J.R. McGrath, has joined us today to discuss this topic. Very good history in the industry, so we're going to make this a very open conversation about what we've experienced looking at applications over the last, I won't say how many years, but probably more than a dozen for each of us. And what testing really does, why waivers exist, and kind of what folks in admissions offices are really looking for people that go through a waiver. JR, what did I miss? What else can we say about yourself and Tepper? Welcome to the session today.
No, absolutely. And Mike, thank you for partnering on this. I know we're excited for it. I know when we were kind of just chatting as colleagues and trying to figure out what would be useful for candidates out there, this is one of those sessions where there always seems to be the question, and I know we were joking on the words of it, it's kind of like to test or not to test, right? Like what is going to set you up for success? And I think that it's something that would love to have a conversation about it, and we can kind of walk through some things here that will be helpful for people to kind of make that best assessment for themselves. As Mike said, and I'll do this quick intro here. So my name's JR. I just became the executive director of master's admissions here at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon. Pittsburgh is my hometown, so love being here. For me, I moved away for 17 years as a professional, spent time at other colleges, and then got to kind of bring my personal and professional life together again at Carnegie Mellon and in Pittsburgh. So I've been back for about a year and a half. So happy, maybe not during the session, but maybe connect with candidates after. Happy to talk more about Carnegie Mellon, Pittsburgh, etc. But today we'll kind of stay on topic and try to help everybody understand what's going to put them in the best light for their MBA applications.
Yeah, and it's a great place to start, because I think one of the things, and part of the session, we're going to talk about these waivers, but we're also going to talk about kind of the misconceptions behind waivers. Mm-hmm. I think what you just alluded to, that first thing, is sometimes waivers aren't for everyone, but they are for a lot of people and for very different reasons. And so maybe what we could start with is, why do waivers exist? So we'll go back a step and say, why does testing exist, right? So we have standardized tests. There's lots of options. The GMAT obviously being the biggest for MBA programs for business schools. GRE has now kind of crept into the space. We're also seeing things like the executive assessment, or some schools even accepting stuff like the MCAT or the LSAT or some other outside, very outside of the box testing. Right. So Jared, in your opinion and from your knowledge, why do tests exist in MBA admissions and that assessment piece?
Yeah, so great question and awesome place to start. I'll do just super quick history here. So, and I'll be honest, I had to look some of this stuff up just to make sure that we had a good baseline here. So tests in particular for business schools or graduate business schools had been around for, I guess the exact year was 1954. So, we're going on, 70 plus years of tests. It was some schools that came together that said, we need to have a better predictor of who can be successful in our curriculum. And it was kind of a collaboration of developing this tool. And initially they did that with some different partners. I believe the initial partner was ETS. They're the ones that actually put out the GRE. And they developed something that they thought would be very specific to business schools. over the years, these things kind of evolve. And I know, Mike, you already alluded to this, is that other tests kind of come into play because in some ways, there's a lot of consistencies. Like if you look at a GMAT and a GRE, they have similar, sections of the test, a quantitative, a verbal, and a writing section. It kind of gives you this opportunity to be able to have a candidate be able to kind of show their academic capabilities. And I think the other thing, and maybe this is more the human side of this piece, is that, someone that has been now in an admissions committee room for over a decade, as Mike alluded to, we won't go to the exact year there, is that it's hard when you're looking at candidates from all over the world that have all of these different backgrounds, they went to all of these different institutions, and being an expert at saying, if this person had this degree and had these grades at this institution, how confident are we that they can be successful in our program and our curriculum? So a standardized test is just that, right? Like it's something that can bring together more of like a baseline of if someone is taking the exams, it gives you a good barometer of, do they have a skill set within these areas that these tests test on? And it can give you a little bit more of confidence when you're looking at certain, people's capabilities.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point because it's in the phrase, right? It's a standardized test, and that's the reason for it. And love it or hate it, it does give everybody the same exact test, or at least the same common set of questions within the question bank to answer. And you're right, it does allow anyone who's reviewing, whether it's an MBA program or if we're talking about tests that are offered in education programs or in engineering, right? If you're coming from a background that isn't business, right, and they've never taken a quant class or not the same types of courses other people have taken, it does let you see, maybe someone has an English degree, but they're really good at math. That just wasn't their passion at the time they were an undergrad. So they come in, they have a great score, and you're able to prove that, yes, I can pass that finance course, that accounting course, kind of those entry level MBA courses that can be very difficult for folks that don't have that background. So I think the purpose of that test and why it's existed for 70 plus years, I mean, I think, it's pretty obvious what that's done for MBA programs and how it's kind of made it a little more equal for folks. At least in the review process. But at the same time, there's some things that make it less equal. And so there are reasons as to why not every single situation is best for taking a test. So at a school like Tepper, what made you switch to a waiver? It's more recent. I know the pandemic may have played a role. I'm not going to say it's the only reason, but a lot of schools over the pandemic did make a decision like that to switch to a waiver process. What was going on in the room at Tepper to make that decision?
Sure. Well, and I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna say one thing first, is I think, when you do this for a long time, there's gonna be times over your career where like you start to get to know candidates and you start to see someone, and then you start to look at application. You're like, this person's so great, but like then unfortunately, like maybe that test score was not like the shining part of their application, right? So there's been times over the years that everyone has said, I wish maybe that test wasn't part of it, right? Because everything else about that candidate is really strong. So I always say like there were these cases throughout the years that everyone kind of like always had in the back of your mind of like, you sometimes wish there would have been another path. But you're right. I think pandemic really kind of accelerated those things. And really for us, it came down to, it was about equity. It was about like disadvantage for some, because let's be honest, as we all went in, and I still remember this, and it's always the funny thing now, right? Is like, I remember when the pandemic hit and I was like, all right, we're going to close down for 2 or 3 weeks and then we'll see you, in a few weeks, right? Like, and now years later. So when we started to realize that it was going to put candidates at a disadvantage, that's when we wanted to make this move and really consider that at a higher level. But that's also, and I know we're not talking about this today, but that's also where deferral processes like kind of, hit a big process, right? So for us, we offered a waiver for everybody that year. And that's actually why a few years ago, our class size was so small, because a lot of people said, no, I'll wait. I want to see kind of what's happening here. So I think the pandemic, because not everybody could take a test, organizations had to pivot and say, hey, can we do this online? How do we do that? I don't know how many people said they tried to do that and then it didn't work out well, or their proctor didn't show up, or the technology failed, right? Yeah. So for us, we wanted to make sure, how do we evaluate a candidate if we couldn't have this information? And it just led into, should we continue this on in some form or fashion? And we've agreed that we think that it's best to keep it going in some form or fashion.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, we saw on our site in the forums and the posts and everything else of how many folks had issues that were, I mean, extenuating circumstances is such a like light term for that, of like people just couldn't get to a test center because they had lockdowns. People could not, maybe didn't have a test center even in their country or city or whatever it may be because of the technology that was needed. So yeah, I mean, there would be a situation where you'd miss out on a really, really strong candidate, right? Just because there was no way they'd be able to even take a test, but they were perfect for your program, right? So with that in mind, right, for waivers in your mind and what you've seen over the years, even pre-offering a waiver out, are there certain types of candidates that you really see make a lot of sense for a waiver, and certain types of candidates that shouldn't even ask for a waiver, that should just kind of take one of the tests and go with that?
Yeah, no, and so excellent question. I think, you know, the way that I'll probably talk about this initially here is that no matter what part of the application you're talking about, putting together an application and trying to represent yourself, it's a strategy, right? Like there's some areas where you know that you're going to be essentially, you know, above the average. There could be some areas where you're at the average, some areas you know that you need to work on. So when it comes to testing, you know, the test part of it really is there to help make sure that you're going to make good decisions on who can be successful in the curriculum. Like you never want to bring someone into a program that you don't think can be successful in it. And I think that's one of the differences I would say that I've learned over the years, because I've not only worked in business schools, I've had other university jobs as well. And there are programs that are more of like survival of the fittest, right? Like law programs, or like maybe even engineering, that a lot of times, like when you're going in there, the goal for a business program is that if you bring in 100 students, as a nice, easy round number, 100 students are graduating, right? So I think that, you know, tests were there to make sure that people could be competitive in the classroom and do that work well. So when you're, so that's that first piece that you want to look at for a candidate. So when you're looking at, can you showcase your academic abilities? What makes sense? So I'm sure everyone has done research. MBA curriculums have at least in the core, have a quantitative nature. It depends what you want to do for your electives later, but you need to go through that. And a lot of people call it like the quant gauntlet. So if you have had coursework that could be similar, it doesn't have to be business coursework, but maybe it was engineering, or maybe you took some math classes. Like every college has different requirements. Some are liberal arts that make you take certain different things. So if you've had coursework that can be similar, or you can make a connection to, and you've done well in that, then that may be a reason for you to consider a waiver, because you're already showcasing, I've been there, I've been able to be successful in this type of coursework. But there's also these others, and you were already alluding to it earlier, which I love that you put this in there, is right. Like there's people that want to make a pivot. Maybe you were an English major. Maybe you were, you know, a musician in college. And your curriculum simply just didn't have that type of coursework. So if you have no data points to showcase that you can do the work in a program, it's really hard for us to then say confidently, yeah, come spend that time, spend that money, and we don't know if you're going to do well. So I really think it's that first barometer of like, do you have things that can already showcase that you can be successful, or do you just not have them yet?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's one thing where applicants, right, of course, you want the path of least resistance. So if you don't have to take a test, you feel like, okay, this is a great option for me, and I'm just going to go for that. But there's a reason to test, not just to get into this school. I think people just think like admissions ends at the time of like enrollment in the program, matriculation, right? Orientation day one, and then you pass them off to the program staff and say, good luck, we're going to go find next year's class. It doesn't. Like the admissions folks do look at retention numbers, do look at graduation numbers. Like that does, those conversations happen in those rooms. So you could admit 1,000, you know, amazing people, but if half of them graduate, that's not great. Like that's going to go back to that admissions group and say, why'd you give us these other 500 people that can't get into the program and can't get through that first class? So waivers, yeah, you have to be very careful with, as an applicant, right? What are they really looking for? What is this going to do for my application? Like, is this just a way for me to avoid a test, or is this going to really showcase my true ability? So that's a really good decision point, because there's more reasons than just getting an easier path to getting into the school. It's getting out of the school, it's graduating, it's
Right.
making it through those courses. We did have a question come in that kind of fits in this topic, actually, of, what advice would you give to someone who is really good in quantitative and also in verbal, based off of whether it's academic records or work history, but they just don't do well on standardized tests? Would it be better for them to go for a test waiver, or, try and work extra hard on doing the test?
Yeah, so excellent question. I think this is it's a nice transition to a couple things. So because I think that there's a couple things to consider here, and this is actually where I was going to go right off of your last comment, but even with this question, is that, so initially what we're talking about here is someone at a level that you feel confident they can do the work, and that's kind of, in a way, like, we'll call it in that category, almost like the yes or no, for admission. But that doesn't bring into competitiveness to the pool. So like the other thing you have to worry about, right? Because like first is like, hey, did I get in? But then like, can I afford that? Is there scholarship consideration? Other things, right? And then there's also these other things that, when I talk about academic competitiveness in the classroom, the way that I think it'd be better explained or context to that is like, can you do the coursework in a reasonable amount of time? Because you need to do all these other things, right? Like, you need to do your career search, you need to do this leadership development, you need to do these other things. And if you spend all your time on the classroom to be successful, you're not going to get the full worth out degree, because you're not going to do these other things. So, when someone asks this question of, if I have really strong academics, but I don't do well on standardized tests, then I would say that a waiver is something that they should strongly consider. And there's many factors that still go into that, because you have to start looking at the schools that are a best fit. What are their policies for that? Are you competitive for them? And we'll get into this later, but I think one of the other things, and this is, one of those unintended benefits. I know we always talk about consequences, but I'm going to say benefit.
Yeah.
When someone studies to take the test, they're studying to be a student again, because this is something with an MBA. Typically, you go and get work experience, you're out of that student mindset. And hey, we all work, right? We're all busy people, but there's a difference of trying to learn and study things in terms of like, what mental energy that takes compared to being a student again. So studying for the test, even if you're not going to use it, or trying to be a student again, has that benefit of, you don't know it yet, but it's going to help you when you join the program.
Yeah, and so that is obviously a very nice unintended benefit, I guess, right, of doing that test. Yeah, that's a great point. And so, I guess looking also towards the positive, negative, as you mentioned, sometimes there's good consequences, bad consequences. In your experience, one of the rumors out there is that there's a negative connotation towards folks that have gone through the admissions process with a waiver, right? So, it could be either alums or current students that say, oh, that person had an easier path. Do they belong here? Do they not? Right. And I know that was a conversation I've had in some of the schools I worked at when we were deciding, do we do waivers or not? It was, we did these like focus groups, and we asked current students, and they said, well, I had to take a test, so they should have to take a test because the degree now is different. Which I don't agree with that, but I wasn't a student at that school. I was a staff member. So, do you deal with that? Do you have any of those conversations? Is that something that has come up in moving towards this waiver process at your school?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always those things. And I'll say that even the other way I've heard it is almost like the rite of passage, right? Like those that came before you had to do it, so they always feel like maybe others should. But I also think it really comes back down to, though, if you always keep the student front of mind of what do they really need to be successful, and not always say like, well, we've always done it this way, so we should just kind of keep this requirement in there. It usually puts yourself, like, if you're trying to stay status quo, it usually doesn't help you grow your program, have a really good brand, kind of go with what those trends are and really what the needs are. Because we always have two consumers. We have the consumer on the front end, which are the candidates coming in the program, and we have those employers on the back end. And we always want to make sure that we can get the right people that the employers are going to want, because that's what creates your brand. That's what creates people that want to go through your program. So I will say, yes, there is that conversation. What I would say to that, though, is for us in particular, we don't see it as a negative. we see it as something that, you know, someone can showcase and have a strong application without it. We're 100% open to it. There's nothing that gets put on your file that says you're a test waiver, you're in this category over here. But here's what someone needs to really think about. I know we've kind of talked through this a little bit already, but I'll say in this piece is that, you know, the way that this typically works is that, you know, in a general application, right, like you have all these different data points that you can look at. And if someone takes away one of those data points in a certain category, then we still need to weight that category because we still need to make that decision. Is now that you have less things going into it, so all those data points going into it are now weighted a little bit more. So if there is no standardized test, then your previous grades or the type of work that you do, your professional certifications, all those types of things hold a heavier weight because you don't have that other data point. So, you know, even back to that previous question from that candidate is like, I don't do well in standardized tests. Should I apply for the waiver? It's a possibly or probably, but it also depends on, you know, where those things kind of fall in, whether the rest of that stuff puts you in a really good, strong position or not.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, you know, if you weighted everything equally and there's, you know, 5 aspects to MBA applications, what we try to tell people, it's like everything counts 20%. You take one of those out, everything counts 25% now. So it needs to be, you know, all those other areas need to be 5% better than what you think it should be if you had the test, right? So, you know, and that's obviously that's not how it works. But if you were to try to explain it to a 5-year-old, right, like that would be the way.
Absolutely right. Like,
you know,
right. It's not always a straight line, but that's a very good, simple way of explaining the concept.
Yeah. Right. So, and please, anyone leaving this session, it's not like, okay, don't go do the math that your GPA has to be 5% higher than Tepper's average and you're in. Like there's more to it than that. It's an art, not a science. Okay. So with that, another, you know, common kind of thing that pops up with waivers is, let's say you submit for a waiver, right? Because it's a waiver request. It's something that you would have to get approved for before applying to the program. Let me make sure is that correct with your process?
So so most candidates know. So with anybody that's applying directly through our program and our application, our waiver process is in the application.
Okay.
And the reason that we do that, and this is, you know, I know everybody, not everybody, a lot of people want that decision beforehand, but for us to make a confident decision, just what we were talking about, we like to see the full application, because what we're considering is not just your academic background, but what is the type of work that you do? What are your professional certifications, right? I mean, someone saying that they have a CFA designation or a CPA or other things could go towards the type of work or the other things that they've had to do that can show that academic capability. So because we want to use all those factors in deciding waiver, it is part of the application for us. We will give a decision back within 10 business days of you submitting the application. So you should get that early. And if for whatever reason, if you're declined a waiver, we'll give you a date that you have to turn and test by of that round. And if you don't get it in by that date, we just simply move you to the next round. So it doesn't put you at a disadvantage. We're trying to be as, you know, efficient as possible. But for us, it is part. Now, I said, if you apply through our application, there's only one process that's outside of that, because there are partner organizations we work with, and the consortium is one of those. They have a common application. So because you apply through their application, there's a form for us that you fill out first, and then we have to tell the consortium your waiver is granted before they send us your application.
Got it. That's great. Good thing that you remembered that. Slightly different process. And that is kind of where I was going with that is, you know, for folks that are kind of on the fence, like, do I do a waiver? Do I not? I'm not sure if I'll get approved. It's not a no and you're out. Like it's a, you know, hold on here. Like it's kind of a pause and now go take the test, right? So if Tepper or another school that offers waivers, if that is, you know, a school you really want to attend, put your best foot forward, still put the application together, ask for that waiver. Worst case scenario, you're gonna have to go prepare for the test, but I'm guessing there's going to be a test in your future at many schools anyway. So it's kind of just giving yourselves a shot at kind of both of those entry points into that process. So I think that's good for folks to know that it's not a complete no if the waiver is disallowed. It's more of a, you know, hey, you got some great stuff going on, go and take a test, get back to us, and let's kind of reevaluate at that point. So very, very key difference there for folks to know. Question came in, and we were going to get to this in a bit, but I think we're probably getting towards that now, is kind of, you know, so let's say you get approved for the waiver, you're in, what happens next kind of things, right? So the question in the Q&A right now is, if you are granted a waiver, you get into Tepper, which is fantastic, right? Will it affect your chances for scholarship? I guess both in, receiving one and not receiving one, and then the amount of that scholarship versus, people who come through with the test score. Thoughts?
100%. So here's what I can say, and this is because let's also be honest, there's trends over time, right? And so like when you're asking others that maybe have gone through the process in previous years, there's a lot of times that it can be consistent year to year. This is going to be a year where it's different at Tepper. As you already kind of alluded to earlier in the session, so we have some new leadership here above me, but as well as, so I just took over as executive director. We have talked and there is not going to be any difference in terms of if you are a test waiver or if you have a test in terms of your scholarship consideration, whether you're eligible for just certain scholarships or all, you are eligible for all scholarships. Now, all of our scholarships are merit-based. So back to what we were just talking about, though, is so if you're looking at this and you take that data point out, so you need to make sure that if you're going to apply with a waiver, not only are your academics good enough to get a waiver, but how are they competitive to the pool, right? So, and when we're looking at this, and this is for me to try to be as upfront and honest as possible, is that, we're looking for you to do well in some quantitative coursework. A B or better would be doing well. Do you have a few of those different classes? And then we look at all those other things, like you said, your resume, work, et cetera, and all that goes into that decision. And that's more of the yes or no. Do we think you can do the work in the classroom? When we get to scholarships, now you're looking at, right? So like last year, we had 2,300 apps for our full-time program. So now you're looking at not only what can I do the work in the classroom, but how do all these other factors stack up against everyone else in the pool? And you are eligible for everything, but you just need to have, and I say it in this way, you need to have the honest personal reflection moment, right? Like when you look at this and you kind of figure out where all these things lie, that is it going to be something that is going to put you in the more competitive category or less competitive category?
Yeah, it's it all makes sense. That's fantastic, actually. So I guess it had been the case where it would have been different depending on which way you come through, and now that's not the case.
Yeah, so I think it's evolved over years, and I think this will take us into other questions, but I'm going to say this because I think it's really helpful to know.
Yeah.
So, and I'll use about test waivers, but I'll even use it because I think we alluded to the GRE earlier as well. So, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, schools started to accept the GRE as also an entrance exam for MBA programs. Anytime you do something new, you don't have very much data on it of how it's going to work out for candidates over time. So when we take a new test or we do a test waiver, let's just say, so like if someone's applying now, they don't start until next fall, then they go through the program for a couple of years. You want to see how they do academically, and then you want to see, was there any impact on the job front, right? So making a decision now takes those few years for that to go out. And usually in the first years, you're not going to have everybody that has a test waiver. You're not going to have everybody with one test. So sometimes it's not only waiting for that 4-year cycle to kind of like play itself out, but then it's going to be a few of those 4-year cycles. So, and it just takes time for people to feel comfortable with this. And I know there's likely going to be a question coming up about career, so we're going to get into that. I thought that'd be like a really good lead in, right? Because it's like, there are some different industries or different companies that have used test scores. And in some ways, we almost always follow employers and their trends, right? Because we want them to want to come after our talent. This is one of the cases where we have to lead and they're going to try to follow a little bit. So on the employer side, a lot of people are still trying to figure out the test stuff that we were trying to figure out a few years ago.
Yeah. And I was going to follow up on your data thing, but I think that's a great point, as you said, to lead in with is, are you seeing that? Is your career office having those conversations? Because one of the other common kind of decision factors for folks that want to go into consulting, usually investment banking,
right.
The historical thing has been provide your GMAT score, and we will take that with your application to our internship or job or whichever it is. And that's part of that recruiting process. So as switching that now on the school side, what is being done, or what are you hearing about those opportunities? Are they still available for students, or is that going to be a hurdle later on?
Sure. So So let me start with this piece of this first. So you mentioned these two, and investment finance and consulting are definitely the ones most well known for that. And I would say because they're typically known as some of the most highly sought after, maybe the higher compensation type roles. So also when you have something that is usually high volume application, you can set different parameters because you have so many applicants, and how do you start wading through to get to who you think are the best talent to even start interacting with? So you're right, test scores have been part of those. What we're hearing from our career coaches, because for us, we have industry specific career coaches. They've all worked in those industries. They run contacts. So like, our finance coach is the one that's meeting with all the investment firms and consulting, et cetera. So they're always asking for that. And I will also say this, right, is like, so a company can tell you their policy, but then at the end of the year, you also have to look at, okay, so what was the trends? They say that they're open for people that have a test waiver, but did they hire everybody that had a test? And sometimes that may or may not be like, so did they say a policy that they didn't follow, or did that coincidentally of how it turned out? Maybe the candidates that were most prepared had the test.
Sure.
So it's not always like you said before, right? It's not always a straight line. What we're hearing specifically right now is that on the investment finance side, it seems to be more open without tests. However, that also means all of the things that you need to do within that interview process have a higher weight, right? So
Right.
like
Yeah.
your modeling skills, your case skills, like all these things on the investment finance side need to be sharper if you're going to apply without that test score. Same on the consulting side. Now I'll say like it's not as prevalent. Like when we talked to the finance group, they were like, probably not going to matter. Don't really worry about it. Just find the best talent, et cetera, et cetera. On the consulting side, they still say like, well, most are saying they'll consider waivers. However, we're still not exactly sure that if it's still going to put you in the best light. So, and I guess I'll say, so even back to what we were talking about before, let's be honest, when we've done this for a long time, even before waivers were a thing, I've had candidates every year that were the outliers, right? That like didn't have the test score that everyone said, and they still got the job at the consulting firm. Typically, if you want to be that outlier, that means that you have to network more. That means that all of your case, like you have to knock everything else out of the park. So I would say on this is like consulting is still for top firms. And let's also be honest, because I know this probably went out as well. Consulting up the game on salary again. Like they are definitely the top of the food chain for MBA talent right now. So, MBB, like they're up in the 190s for base salary now, right? So if you're at that level and everyone's going to go after you, they can set whatever parameters they want. And we always try to figure that out. But let's also be honest, they make the decisions on their hiring. They could say something and make a shift mid-season, and there's not much we can do for it. So I would just say, and maybe this is where we get into some other conversations here. If you have those aspirations, try a test. If it doesn't go well for you, you don't have that score, then at least you know that this is my path that I have to go on. But right now, I wouldn't say like, don't worry about it. I would still say it could come up into your job search later.
Yeah, and I think that last bit, right, 2 years away. So you can, I don't know if I recommend this. I don't know if I should even say it out loud, but you could, if you're doing some good things in recruiting and you have an interest in consulting and you got in with a waiver, take a test while you're there. Like the test, you can, you know what I mean? Like that's another option for you. If that doesn't change by the time you're recruiting for consulting roles and you need to provide a test, go take a test. I mean, there's breaks in between semesters where instead of taking one of your trips, which I know is very valuable for MBA students, that $200,000 salary is probably also very valuable, and you can travel, at other times. Use that vacation time to prepare for, and then go and get a GMAT score. So that way you can still have opportunities at those jobs post MBA. So it's not like you got into the program, the door's shut on those types of roles because, oops, I got him with a waiver. It's just, same way as getting into the program with a waiver, things are going to be a little different for you in that process. It might be the same situation leaving the program that you may have to kind of make adjustments on the fly. And that's what this world is right now, adjustments on the fly. I mean, I think that's just, maybe we're all getting better at that. The old, I'm stuck in my ways, that you can't do that anymore. So if you're not flexible, the companies aren't flexible. Obviously, it sounds like the schools are definitely trying to be flexible. That's where, you're going to be on the wrong side of those interviews pretty quickly if you're not willing to kind of go that extra mile when you're asked to. So yeah, all things to consider. And I like your other point too of like, I would love to say, yeah, everyone goes to their MBA, they all get into MBB and like it's a big happy world, but that's not going to happen for every single person. So if the testing is going to be the factor that kind of makes you pivot a little bit off of that, maybe that's a good thing that you don't find out too late
Sure.
in your recruiting process that like, hey, this might not be your career. You know, you can kind of make those decisions a little earlier. So yeah, lots of things to consider there. But I think the best thing I heard in your whole answer was you have a career team who is aware of this situation. They're working on this situation. They're working on behalf of their students. So I think that's a really key thing to take away is that the schools aren't just sitting back and letting this all happen. I mean, there are conversations happening. There's people that are on the student side, and that's what all of this is. I mean, everyone's always, the schools especially, are trying to be on the student's side on all of this. So I think that's really good information. So JR, what else? Like, what else do we need to know about testing, waivers? Like, is there anything that we've missed in these questions so far that you think is important? And we do have another question that came in, so I'll kind of let you go with that, and then I can shift over to that.
Here's what I guess I would say, and this is kind of like, maybe this is the little bit of summary to make sure that we didn't miss anything, but like make sure that we're connecting all the dots here. So for us in particular, Tepper, we are open to test waivers. There's not going to be any negative connotation with it. If you have questions, reach out, meet with our team, kind of talk through that. What I would say overall though is like, so when you're thinking about, is this right for you, you need to look at what does your application look like? So what is your previous academics? You know, do you have an undergraduate and a graduate degree? Just an undergraduate degree? How similar of those curriculums were they to a business curriculum? What did your grades look like? Are they just competitive for the waiver and maybe you get a waiver, but not competitive for scholarship? So taking those things into consideration. Thinking through in terms of your career goals. Now, Mike, we brought this up. We just had a conversation about that. That doesn't mean that you as a candidate have to have all of these answers already. But if you tell me you want to go MBB and you apply with a waiver, and we start talking about that in your interview and you were not knowledgeable about that, that like a test score could go into that, what that reflects in is that maybe you didn't do enough research into your chosen career field. So
they didn't attend our webinar. That's even worse.
So trying to be that informed candidate all goes into these things, right? And there's amazing resources out there, right? And that's why I would say in some ways that bar has become a little higher. You don't always just have to meet from a representative of school, which we would love to do with you, but you have these resources like ClearMid and all these other things that you can kind of get these things. So make sure that when you say that you want to do something, you've done a little bit of research and you can answer the why. And then ask that question, right? Like, because we want what's best for you. So if you're considering it and you have a direct question, ask. We would love to help you with it. So maybe, Mike, we can go into that next question and kind of see where it takes us.
Yeah, no, this is actually a good one, because this is one of those, I know that people do this. I've been asked this type of question, and I know it's gonna be hard to answer, but I'm gonna let you go at it. Okay. So let's say that you have a candidate for your program who was approved for a waiver, but then on their own, they said, you know what, let me go take a test and just kind of see where I land and collect a score, right? But let's say it's below the average. So whatever score that is, we'll just pick a number. So what do you suggest that person does with their application? Would they continue as a waiver applicant, or would they submit the below average score? And you know what, pick two different numbers maybe for your below average score, because the answer may change, I'm going to guess. So
so one, okay, so here's the thing that I think that is really exciting about this, is that the candidate controls their application, right? And I'll say it in this way. Once you officially share your score with us via an application, send us your score through GMAT or GRE or whoever you took your test through, we have to use it for consideration, right? Like once you give it to us, it's very unethical to say, oh no, we could just set that score aside, right? Like that's not something we can ever do. So if you have that score, it's up to you of whether you want to use it or not. So when you're looking at this, I think, for us, again, like this is how it works. So our process is you apply in the application, you say you want a test waiver, you can be granted that test waiver. Or if we say, hey, you're not granted, then give your test, right? Like you can provide it then. I think the question is a little bit more in like, if I do it after, if you feel like it helps you, then share it. If you feel like it, if it doesn't, then that's something that obviously, you wouldn't want to share. I would say this also, right? Like you can also have a conversation with someone. So, depending where you're at in this process, right? So reaching out to someone on the admissions team, going to normal office hours. If you've already interviewed for the program, reaching out to the person interviewing and say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to officially share my score. I don't know if it's going to put me in the best light. Like you can kind of have these conversation generalities and maybe they can give you some specific advice because this is very much about like your whole application, right? But that biggest piece is like, once you share it officially, like we can't take it away. So it has to go in there. But I would also say there's another scenario here. There's a scenario where maybe it wasn't below the average, right? Like maybe I took one more go because you were talking about this consulting thing. Like, hey, I took a test. I worked really hard and I rocked it. Can I share it? Can I be reconsidered for something later? I would say the answer to that is yes. There are standards for admissions, and as long as we're using the test that you're giving us that to make the admissions decision, then those things can change. So I think always reach out and talk to that admissions officer that you've been working with. We want what's best for you. We really do. We're not going to try to give you advice to put you in a bad position. So ask. Hopefully that's helpful for that candidate.
Yeah. I think that's a very fair answer. And I would say to add on to that, and you alluded to it, is what we hear from any of the admissions directors that we work with at ClearAdmit, the common thread is we read apps to admit. We don't read apps to deny.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really key thing for applicants. The more we can get that out there and make sure that applicants understand that, I think questions like this one and the next one I'm going to follow up with would really, it would make them understand how to answer those questions a little bit better themselves. It's like, go and ask them. Like you can send an email and write this exact question and give the numbers, right? So like, let's say that score is a 600 or it's a 650 or it's a 680 or whatever it is, that may also be different because how far is it below the average, or how does it relate to the rest of the stuff that you have going on in your app? And we discussed earlier about how when you remove one of those kind of inputs, those data inputs into an application, all the boats kind of raise higher, right? To make up for it. So, if you're inserting this back in because the rest of your stuff wasn't as high as you thought it was, but like this score might actually equal it all that. Like there's a lot of things you got to think about. So ask those questions. Admissions directors are not gatekeepers that are sitting there stamping denials on everybody. Like I never liked the term ding either. Like I don't know where that came from, but I only heard it when I started working here. We hated that. I did not like to deny anybody to our program because you meet these folks, whether you're on the road or in an info session or whatever it is, and like that you see the passion they have for your program, and it sucks. Like that's the worst part of the job is saying no. So I would always like to help people, and with those advice, like I would look at everything you have, and I would tell you exactly what I think. Again, it's a think. Like based on stuff I've seen, comparisons that I have, like that score is either going to make it or break it for you. And I would just let you know. And the decision is ultimately yours, but we're not going to say, oh yeah, submit the score and I'm going to deny you tomorrow. Like that's not what people are looking to do, as much as I think the applicant pool wants to believe that. Like,
no, and Mike, you bring up a great point there, because obviously my last recommendation was reach out, talk to someone.
Right.
So this is the other thing is like, so these are conversations and people can give you, like you said, advice, they can give you opinions. But no one, not even myself, like in a one-on-one unofficial chat with someone, I can't tell someone they're going to be admitted, right? There's a whole committee, there's a whole process for this. So it's really just like, having good feedback and then taking that feedback and making that decision for yourself and then moving forward with whatever plan you think is best for you. So collect the feedback, right?
Yeah.
As many opinions as you can, because the best decisions are always those that are informed.
Yeah. Another great tool for that, by the way, ClearAdmit plug really quick, is our Plywire feed, where you can plug in all your information, and our team, who are former admissions consultants, former admissions directors, they will comment and give you that advice as well. So if you don't want to go to this school, or if you have multiple schools you're considering, right, that's another way you can kind of get that feedback. JR, another kind of semi follow-up to that is when you're comparing kind of like undergraduate GPA to a longer time in the workforce, how does that balance out? I mean, I guess I could probably answer that for you and say it's kind of the same, right? It's all of these input factors. They do balance each other out. It's a holistic review. You know, it's going to be another one of those, like, go and ask somebody, I think, right? Am I wrong?
No, so you're not wrong. I would say the one thing to this is like, so when someone asks a question like this, and I'll say like this, the easiest way to say, most recent is most relevant. Because let's be honest, like there's some things in everybody's past or history that maybe it's not like, hey, that was not like the thing that I'm most proud of in my life, right? And the number I saw that they wrote there was not horrible, right? It was 3.1 or 3.2. Yeah. Like, don't be too self-conscious about that, right? However, you know, if you've had, let's say, like an academic past that you're not proud of, the most important thing is like, what have you done since? Why is this time going to be different? Like, these are the questions that you need to be able to answer. And that doesn't mean that there's a certain set of things that you have to do, but as long as you're ready for those questions, the likelihood is it becomes less of a factor rather than something that is going to hold you back. So think through why it will be different and be able to sell the person on it, right? Like, you don't want to spend your whole interview on why did you have poor grades? You want to own it. You want to accept it, tell you why it's different. And it's like a 2 to 3 minute conversation. You move on.
Right. Right. Yeah. And don't just blame it on, oh, I didn't try. It's like, there's more to the story. Get it out there. Optional essay is another great spot for things like that. If you're questioning your own profile as an applicant, utilize that space. I mean, it is optional. I understand it's in the phrase there, but it's there for those reasons. If you do feel like there's a story to be told that doesn't fit anywhere else, that's where that story goes before you get to the interview phase, because you don't want to get passed up on that opportunity to interview because you're letting the admissions committee kind of guess on your history or your career or why you left a job after 6 months or why you failed the course. Put it in there. Like, give them that context to make it easier for them to pass you to that next part of the process. That's the worst thing you want to allow an admissions committee to do, is guess your history. Like, tell them it's better to know, better to put yourself out there. It's a very difficult process because I know I hate talking about myself. I like to talk about other people. I can talk to JR for hours, but if he asked me a bunch of questions about me, I would shut down. Like, it's hard to do that stuff. But this is that time where you have to be a little more vulnerable and get that stuff out there, so that way everyone understands like where you're coming from, what makes you a great candidate, why you'll be a great student at the school you're attending, and onward and upward from there. So JR, good question in the chat. Sorry, I didn't know. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm going to add one thing, then we'll go to the next one. And chat is like, and to summarize that is, you want to be your own storyteller, right?
Yes.
Like, don't let someone else try to write that optional ending for you, right? Like, you know yourself best. And if you are leading the discussion in terms of like what you want to share, it's going to go better.
Yeah. First person for sure. So I'm going to skip to one that was in the chat because it's a good question about how waiver consideration could be different potentially in the different program options that you offer. So I know we've talked, and it's probably my own fault, I focused on full-time a lot during this session, but this particular candidate's asking about executive MBA programs, or even just other programs in general, right? If the evaluation for waivers might be a little different based on what people are sending you.
No, absolutely. So one, I think so when you talk about other program formats, now this is where we're a little bit different. So we have one MBA program that's offered in multiple
mediums.
I'm blanking on a word right now. So it's not different formats, but it's essentially one MBA program, 3 ways to get it. And it's more about like the flexibility there. So for us, the bar isn't changing, but sometimes, like someone brought up an MBA, right? Sometimes those are lockstep program. Maybe it's not as in the weeds in terms of some of that quant gauntlet that we talked about. So they may have different requirements, which may lead to different admissions criteria. I would say when I do my benchmarking with other schools and programs, a lot of times the part-time options, which executive would fall into, have less stringent criteria. But it's also like, you got to think of the why, right? Like, typically you're taking a class or two at a time, right? Like you have more time to work on that. Like, so there's different things to go about that. In a full-time, you're kind of in 3 or 4 quant classes at a time. They're all condensed. So it's not, it's just a different program. So they're usually a lot more flexible on those things, as well as they developed a whole new test for this, the EA, right? Because we also know as someone that wants or needs to do a program part-time, maybe that means that they don't have that extra personal flexibility time to be able to do some of the things that maybe a full-time candidate can do. So it all goes back to like, everybody wants to make a good decision to make sure when you bring someone in, they're successful. Because let's also be honest, like one of my biggest fears is someone goes in the program, they come back to my office 3 months later and be like, Jared, why didn't you tell me, right? Like it's kind of the like, you know, the bad decision that way is that they weren't prepared for things.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, that all makes a lot of sense to me. And the other part of the question is, you know, if they worked for, giving a little more information, but if they worked in like private equity, VC, hedge fund, would the considerations for granting the waivers be different? The consideration, like the process is the same. It'll probably give you a leg up on people who did not have that background because of what that work typically entails. But what you did at those firms also would change, right? If you are working directly and making financial decisions and in that stuff every day, like, yeah, okay, that's great. That's a very heavy quant background. But if you're in like the marketing department at BlackRock, it's like, that's not exactly the same thing, right? So it's not just like what industry, it's what was your job? What was your role? Like they're looking at your resume when making decisions on waivers or not waivers. So get your resume ready to go. Like you're applying to the school, especially at Tepper, if it's part of the process, like get your resume ready to go to show if you're going for a waiver, where you've had that background in quant, what you've done to make it easier for them to kind of see those things, see those bullet points, and understand that you already have that background. So you'll be able to pass those courses. Because again, that is the major factor. And when we did waivers at the schools I worked with was, I would love to get more people in the program. I'd love to get different people from different backgrounds in the program. We cannot have them fail that first course. So we need to have that at a bare minimum. We need to know you'll be able to pass that first finance, first accounting course. So
now I will say, like, I have seen that with other programs when they say like there's a minimum number of years of work experience for a waiver. So everybody has different things, right? Like this is definitely more of the art than the science of our industry. So I would definitely, you know, reach out to those programs to ask whatever's in your consideration set. Now, we do not have an executive MBA. Our part-time MBA kind of fills that need for us overall. And we have the same waiver criteria no matter what program format. Like I said, we have the one MBA program. But for those candidates that are looking at those other formats, ask those schools, because I think, you know, in particular, a lot will probably be very direct of what's needed. But you're right, Mike, in the way of when work experience comes into it, it's what is your day-to-day work doing? Like my undergrad was in physics. I would not want to do a physics problem now. Like it's been over 20 years since I've like really had to like get in there and like, you know, like work a problem. Doesn't mean I didn't have
friction and
point, but
yeah.
But those skills atrophy over time, right? Like so if you're not doing that, even if you are in a quantitative organization, doesn't mean that everybody's working at that level every day.
That's very true. And by the way, I work in marketing, so I'm not knocking marketing at BlackRock. I just want to make sure I make that clear. That it's very fair industry and job title and job responsibilities, but it is different. I'm just kind of displaying that difference. And I picked on English majors before too, so you know we're all being fair here. Okay, so one other question that came through, and this could be specific to Tepper. After someone is granted the waiver, is that it? Like, is that the evaluation for the program, or does it kind of go through a different evaluation for the waiver and then into kind of the normal process from there to be kind of reevaluated? So I guess if you can kind of connect those dots for this particular person.
So very easy for us. 2 separate processes. And the reason for that is you apply for the waiver. We're going to give you that decision within that 10 days. Our decisions for our rounds don't go out until like, you know, so about 2 months after on average. But the thing that this is key is that we need to have an interview to make an admissions decision. And you're not going to have that when you get your waiver decision. So we cannot make one. So I think that this is a question we get all the time, right? Is like, hey, I got a waiver, but then I wasn't granted admission. So we really just looked at it as like, are you able to do the work in the classroom? And then it kind of goes into this other pile. So it is 2 separate processes.
There we go. All right. We had one more in here about IR and how much that counts for the process within the GMAT. So that third section.
So I'll
Fourth,
just talk about this. So whether it's IR or not, but like there's multiple sections, right? So there's the writing score, there's IR. Here's the thing that we look at, right? Like if someone did really well in the one part and then did really poor in the other part, there's always that question. We were just talking about like, being the author of your own story, right?
Yeah.
It's not that I don't think that you can now do the work possibly, but I'm like, what happened over here? It kind of adds that question mark of, did they not try? Did they not have that skill set? So I think this is an awesome opportunity. You mentioned the optional essay before. If that's what you wanted to do and that's what your score is and that's what you're going to apply with, write the essay. Tell the story of why the IR score or the writing score or whatever score is lower. Because if not, we're going to come up with whatever we think could be plausible. Maybe we have 4 options or 2 options of why, but don't leave it up to us. Tell us why. But I will tell you that would raise a question of, I wonder why.
There you go.
Yeah,
that's fair. And so I don't see any more questions. So to wrap up, tell us what's going on at Tepper. When's the next round deadline? When can folks who are in the process hear back? Like, let's get a good little, what can we expect next from this group who's here?
Sure. So right in the middle of round 1. So I'll say this first. We are not through all the applications to put out all the invitations to interview. So if you've already applied and you didn't get the invitation yet, we are still reviewing. Do not freak out yet. We're still sending out invitations to interview.
I'll put the alert on Reddit for you, believe me.
If you haven't applied yet and you're considering, the next round is January 5th. So you have plenty of time from now until then to be able to get all these things together. There's going to be different events going on. You can come and interact and ask questions. We have our diversity weekend coming up November 11th and 12th. So whether you've already applied or not applied, or maybe just considering to apply in future years, come check out that weekend. It's usually, great time with students, with alumni, with everyone, like to really get a sense of the community. And there's going to be things throughout the year that you're going to be able to check out like that. So go to our website, look at our event section. But overall, and Mike said this earlier, and I just want to reiterate this. We love meeting people. We love talking to people. We're always looking at, are you the right fit? Can you be the right fit here? Like, it's not from the negative connotation. We're always trying to find the fits. So reach out. We love chatting with people.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for reaching out to this audience today to talk about this particular topic. I feel like this will be very popular post even just today's session, because this is very, very commonly asked on our forums and other ones that we see out on the web. So I really appreciate you being very candid about your process, what you're looking at Tepper, how this kind of all fits into the puzzle of MBA admissions, and how much thought has gone into it. I think that's a really key thing that it's great for folks to understand, is that it's not just a quick decision of like, yeah, we're going to do waivers now. It's like, there's a lot that went into that. So it's very important that that stuff is considered as well. And ask questions. If anybody here today, if we didn't get to your question, or if you have more as you leave, reach out, whether it's on our site or to JR and his team directly. We'll make sure we get your questions answered. And again, this video will be posted publicly on clearadmit.com. We'll make sure you guys get that link. But JR, again, thank you so much for joining us and talking through all this.
Absolutely. It was fun from our side as well. So everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll catch you at the next event.